Another episode of Witty CFB. Your host, Rob Sheply here. And on today's episode, we are going to be discussing the Florida Gators quarterback controversy between DJ Lagway and Graham Mertz. Now, for those who were watching, Florida had a tune-up game versus Samford this past Saturday, and quite frankly, DJ Lagway looked electric. He looked poised. He looked confident. He was able to look a lot more mobile. He was making his wide receivers look good, and he was able to really get outside the pocket and extend plays, which is all good. Here's a stat line here. He went 21 for 31, 3 touchdowns, 1 interception for 487 yards. And, with that said, he's one of the top, prospects, coming out of his class, and, the hype around him is legitimate. And, he's gotten a lot of, particularly, kind of his intangibles and his physical traits. A lot of those comparisons have been to, 2022 quarterback and now NFL Indianapolis Colt Anthony Richardson, which everything is completely valid. And, with that said, Graham Mertz obviously has been dealing with concussion, and it seems like he's out of protocol now, and he could possibly be healthy for the Texas A&M game. So with that said, now there's a lot of controversy surrounding, who should start this game. Now there's a couple different variables here because, for starters, I don't think people give Graham Mertz enough credit, particularly what he did last year, and particularly his, sort of evolution between him coming from Wisconsin to what he was able to do at Florida. I mean, obviously, a lot of the main criticisms that he had coming into Wisconsin is that he, wasn't poised enough. He wasn't, he was turning over the ball a lot of interceptions, kind of being reckless with the ball compared to what we saw, last season. He was a lot more relaxed. He didn't turn the ball over as much, and was quite frankly a much better decision maker than what we saw in years past. However, the issue that I think was evident in the Miami game was it seems to me that Billy Napier's play calling has definitely been a little bit too conservative and quite frankly even predictable. I mean, even Miami's coaches were saying that, in the press conferences of, we pretty much knew the first 6-7 plays that they're going to come out with, and it showed on the football field too. Now, although I do think, I think one can argue that Billy Napier is in essence coaching for his job against Texas A&M. I mean, you do have Mississippi State and UCF and a couple of those games after before you go through the gauntlet of Ole Miss and Georgia and Florida State. But at the same time too, I don't necessarily think he is coaching for his job, but I think in the eyes of the Gainesville faithful, he essentially is, because I think, especially if you talk to a lot of those fans and kind of how Billy responded to some of the criticism, it definitely wasn't taken very well. And, quite frankly, it shouldn't have been taken well. I think a lot of people got, quite frankly, pissed off about it. And it's shown there's a lot of tension there and all that stuff. But, do I think DJ Lagway should be the future of this program? Absolutely. But here's where you have the struggle. For starters, the most obvious struggle is, let's say you go 6-8 games in and you realize Billy's not the guy, and you fire him. The writing's almost on the wall to that Lagway is going to transfer, because even if you do let him play the rest of the season, what makes you think that he wants to sit through a quote unquote rebuild with the first year head coach, compared to, going to a program like Ohio State or Georgia or, Texas or any one of those big schools where everything's already there. He shows up, he has the weapons that he needs, and he's ready to go. Whereas right now, the offensive line is atrocious, so that forces him to, extend the plays beyond the pocket. He does have Montreal Johnson behind him, which definitely is a big positive. And I've been saying this on the show over and over again that they really do need to find ways to utilize him more, especially when it's shown that we just simply cannot pass block to save our lives pretty much. But in any event, although we do have all those positives, I would just find it very difficult to not start Mertz. I mean, in terms of, the injury report and everything, the SEC does require to have that list out by Wednesday. So we'll know by then in terms of exactly how Mertz is going to be listed. And also, Billy Napier did say that he's going to quote play two quarterbacks. But if you're Napier and you're Florida, why would you announce to the media? You're not going to announce to the media who's starting at quarterback until the very you know time that the ball drops, because at this point you pretty much want Texas A&M to prepare for both of them. But in a sense too, I think we can kind of generalize what's going to happen with either one of them. I think if you start Graham Mertz, which I'm of the minority in the sense that I do think you need to start him. One, because I do think he has that experience. Two, I don't think he has legitimately lost the job. And three, there's just way too much risk throwing Lagway into the fire with that offensive line. And he really doesn't have that many weapons. I mean, obviously Eugene Wilson is his biggest weapon, but outside of that, that was a big question mark even going into the year, is that a lot of these younger receivers were going to have to step up. And when you have a defense like Texas A&M coached by Mike Elko, I mean, it's definitely a tall task. I mean, I do think Texas A&M, they looked all right versus Notre Dame. I think the offense was definitely kind of the Achilles heel to that team ultimately. But the issue is, yes, I guess Lagway kind of had a sort of a softy beginning, but the issue is, if Lagway were to struggle, you can't really at that point you can't really go back to Mertz, because you pretty much destroyed his confidence already. You pretty much just said to Mertz, hey, we're gonna go with Lagway, we're going with the future here. Thanks for coming back, and you can just kind of ride the pine until your season's up. So that's really where you have the struggle, because if you have Lagway still, you don't have as much of that. You don't have as much of that pressure too, because you know, let's say if Mertz does struggle for the first two halves versus Texas A&M, right? If he struggles those first two halves, then you have the sort of segue into justifying Lagway coming in. Because if Mertz struggles and Lagway comes in and he ends up being great, then it's a more natural kind of progression in terms of Lagway ultimately getting the starting job. But to kind of say, oh yeah, we're just going to start Lagway and put Mertz to the side, you have that catch-22 where if you go all in with Lagway, then if he struggles, then it's going to be hard to go back to Mertz. It's kind of I think this is really similar to back in 2020 when you had Felipe Franks and Kyle Trask, where yes, they did ultimately stick with Franks for a more extended period of time, and eventually Kyle Trask ultimately proved that he was the better guy. But I think this scenario is a little bit different in the sense that I think it was more agreed upon that Trask was obviously has more intangibles and has a lot more of a lot more of those physical aspects and characteristics that were a lot more valuable in a Dan Mullen offense compared to Felipe Franks. So the writing was kind of on the wall anyway. Whereas with this situation, you do have both competent quarterbacks, and I would definitely argue that Lagway does have more of the upside and all of that too. But I think too, if you're a Billy and you put Lagway in, you're pretty much saying, like, you're pretty much asking to save your job for him. Because I even said this on the show before the season started. I don't think Florida and Napier have to make it to a bowl game this year for him to get another season. I think he has to at least upset one of the bigger teams, like I said before. But I think most importantly, he has to look competitive. I mean, the reality is if they go into Ole Miss and Georgia and Texas A&M, and if they get spanked 2 out of those 3 games, I mean, he's in essence done. But what will happen will happen. But if you ask me, I think the right situation right now is you kind of play posse and say that you're doing either or, even though Texas A&M knows if you're starting Mertz, you're going to expect kind of a more balanced attack, and expect some more conservative play calling where Mertz is going to have to get the ball out super quick to counteract the offensive line. And Mertz is not as big of a sort of an outside threat, but he is a great pocket passer. He does, obviously the biggest critique of him is the long ball accuracy and arm strength. But at the same time, too, if you don't give him those opportunities to at least try it, then you never really know too. So maybe instead of trying to do a play action, like maybe trying to do some verticals and some crossing routes and seeing if you can get some lanes open that way too. Whereas, if going in that DJ is going to be starting, you are going to expect maybe some more RPO options, some more speed options, definitely spreading the field a little bit more. You know, I guess where it's going to come down to is to what the biggest question for me is to what extent will Napier be more aggressive with Lagway up center compared to Mertz too? Because if we do kind of get more similar play calling than what we saw in Miami and Samford, I think this really could be a big week for Texas A&M to kind of bounce back. But at the end of the day, it's a great problem to have for Florida. But I do think ultimately you're kind of stuck with Grant. You're not necessarily stuck, but I think you have to start Graham Mertz for the time being. And I do think you probably have to pull the trigger if you see him struggling within the first half of that Texas A&M game.